This is Frank Gaffney with the Secure Freedom Minute. One of the most intrepid, impactful, and courageous investigative journalists of our time is former Wall Street Journal foreign correspondent and editorialist Claudia Rosette. Her brilliant reporting is the absolute antithesis of fake news. In a first-hand account of the most recent massive demonstrations in Hong Kong, published yesterday at PJ Media, Ms. Rosette provided an invaluable assessment of what motivates their participants. Quote, Hong Kongers, in defying Beijing, may be taking on the Goliath of modern tyrannies, but even against terrible odds, they are committed to this contest. That's how much they value freedom. Perhaps most intriguing were the parents, who, despite the warnings surrounding this protest, brought young children. One after another, these parents told me the protests are all about their children. These are people who know what freedom means and see it as a vital legacy for the next generation. Unquote. Amen.
Frank Gaffney's here, Center for Security Policy, securefreedom.org, and counterjihad.com. That's a Secure Freedom Minute. You can find that when you go to those websites. You can also go to presentdangerchina.org, where he is the vice chair on the committee on the present danger. Frank, let's talk about China. We'll start with these protests. What developments have occurred since last week? Where do we stand as people in Hong Kong try to fight for at least some modicum of freedom against mainland China? Where are we?
I think the most important thing, Alex, is that we saw last weekend another massive demonstration. The organizers claim it was 1.7 million people out of a total population in the territory of 7 million. There are some who say, well, it wasn't quite that large, but it still was very, very substantial. And what it very strongly signaled was the willingness, as the piece you just played made clear, of people of all ages and backgrounds, including people who, were putting their children on the line, came out to engage in peaceful opposition to the regime in Beijing and to what it intends to do to Hong Kong and to their freedoms and to their autonomy. And I guess the point I would say is what has happened as a result of all of that is a further reinforcement of the message to Beijing that they are now facing determined people willing to put everything literally on the line. It has resulted in this Chinese puppet Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, starting for the first time to make noises about some kind of accommodation. I don't think it's real. I don't think the protesters think it's real, but there's now talk of a platform for dialogue. And that may be the first indication that there is going to have to be some kind of negotiated outcome here, not just the possibly murderous crackdown that I'm fearful is what Beijing actually has in mind.
So, Frank, what do you think will be when will this give? I mean, something's going to give here eventually, and China is trying to do some level of a crackdown, but if they go too far, I think it'll attract a lot more international attention than they want. It seems like Xi Jinping is clearly in somewhat of a precarious position. Again, we only get partial information because they don't have a free press. But I think he'd be out there front and center if he felt very confident in the moves he was making. So I think China I think the Hong Kong protesters clearly are feeling emboldened. They keep showing up. They keep protesting. I think the protests are sort of outpacing what a lot of people, even pro-Hong Kong folks, are expecting. But so what? What does that mean? What's next? When does something break here?
Nobody knows, Alex. I certainly don't. The expectation, I must say, I've had for some time is that the Chinese would probably not insert the overt uniformed military forces, either the People's Liberation Army or what they call the People's Armed Police, which they've been massing on the border of Hong Kong now for some time. But rather they would insinuate those troops in either the garb of Hong Kong police or more likely still, the garb of the protesters, these sort of black outfits, or in some cases white ones, that would have them wearing masks and just simply blending into the crowd and then turning on them and using brute force to suppress protesters, to arrest them, to otherwise crack down. That still is very much in prospect, it seems to me. And to some extent, I've been surprised, I have to say, that the Chinese haven't moved more aggressively to this point than they have. The protesters are clearly intent on continuing to assert themselves. There's talk about this next weekend, another effort to interrupt traffic at the international airport. The question, I guess, that just has to be uppermost in our minds, as Claudia Rosette has called for in her reporting, is a further affirmation on the part of our country, our government, that we stand with the people of Hong Kong, that we are on the side of freedom, and that we're not going to put military forces in there or anything like that, but that we can use instruments, and most especially one that is provided for in the statutes of the United States. Specifically, if Hong Kong ceases to be autonomous from Communist China, it will no longer be accorded what's called most favored nation status, which has benefited Hong Kong enormously, but also it's been a backdoor for Communist China to exploit as well. This would be really painful to China and create real material costs to the kind of crackdown that I think otherwise is in prospect here. I hope President Trump will signal that it is absolutely his intention to withdraw that most favored nation status in the event there is further violence or a systematic kind of crackdown on Hong Kong, most especially. I think that may help deter it. Alex.
So the main character here, and again, we tend to focus a lot on characters at Breitbart.com and on the show, is a lady named Carrie Lam, who is the chief executive of Hong Kong. She's pro-Beijing. And would it be incorrect to describe her as an apparatchik for the Chinese communists?
That may be too generous. I think she's really nothing more than their puppet at this point. She was essentially elected by them in a rigged arrangement.
Right.
She has no following in Hong Kong that I can see, other than perhaps others who are closely tied to Beijing, and is generally loathed by those who have been in the street, not least because she has been so indifferent to their appeals for. In
that case, Frank, we'll go with your read that I was too mild. So let's talk about her task, which is essentially to mediate between the two sides, and she's got no credibility on the Hong Kong side.
Well, she's had no willingness to mediate either. I think she doesn't have any running room because the Beijing puppet masters have no intention of negotiating with these protesters. They're really concerned, Alex. It's I think obvious to those of us who are following this closely, but not so much to the wider audience. Perhaps is China is panicked that if this actually runs its course and results in some outcome other than the complete and utter domination of Hong Kong by the Chinese Communist Party, it could create vastly bigger problems for China elsewhere in the mainland. And so that's why she has had no running room, why she has done nothing to try to modulate her position, and therefore, I think, as you say, has no credibility, no standing, really, to be a negotiator with the opposition.
So again, I come back to my original point, which is that I'm concerned that there isn't a clear way for Hong Kong to make progress here. I'm glad that they don't seem deterred. I'm glad that the protests seem to be huge and they seem to continue. But there doesn't seem like Beijing wants to de-escalate at all. In fact, it seems like that the crackdowns might be getting gradually worse week to week, if not day to day. So where do you think this goes, Frank?
Again, it's anybody's guess, Alex, but I will say, I think that if the protesters in Hong Kong can continue to do what they did last weekend, which is to demonstrate peacefully, even if it means violating what the restrictions that have been imposed on them by the police are, and that was very much true in this case. They were told to stay in this one little park, and they overflowed massively its confines and then marched to the Legislative Council, as I understand it. That's going to continue to happen unless and until there's a crackdown. And we have a chance here, Alex. I don't think it's necessarily a certitude, but we have a chance of this coming out better for the people of Hong Kong and perhaps for an awful lot of other people besides, if we stand with them, if we demonstrate solidarity, if we establish that there are real costs to Hong Kong's masters if they wind up crushing autonomy there. And it's worth a try. It's worth being, I believe, very much aligned with freedom in this case. And the alternative is very, very, very frightening, because I'm concerned that what we will see with Beijing, if they succeed in Hong Kong, is simply their appetite whetted for worse in places like Taiwan and perhaps elsewhere in Asia and who knows, far beyond. Their purpose is world domination. Make no mistake about it. Hong Kong is the appetizer course.
Okay, so let me ask you about what the Americans' role and what our role and the president's role. What options do we have here? Because again, it's very complicated geopolitically. I think you and I are in the camp that would like the president to make a bolder statement. He seems reluctant to do that for whatever reason. I think because he needs to negotiate and deal with communist China as well. But Hong Kong does have favored status in the eyes of the United States. So what is we talked about this a lot last week, Frank. Has anything changed?
I think what's changed is the president has been ratcheting up his rhetoric a bit. He has been, I think, increasingly expressing what I'm calling for, which is an affinity for the people of Hong Kong, a concern about their safety, a fear that there may be troops put in on the ground and that would result in perhaps another Tiananmen. I mean, those are the sorts of markers down that are very important. I think what he has been simultaneously signaling, though, which I would urge him to throttle back, is determination to get a deal with China on trade. As we've discussed before, Alex, I'm really persuaded that even if he could get good terms to such a deal, and I don't think there's much prospect of that at the moment, at least, China won't honor those terms. We know that. This is their consistent practice. So all we will have done is sort of mortgage his presidency to propping up this idea that we've somehow worked the problem with Beijing, and it unfortunately won't be. So I think he has opportunity to further make clear that we regard our relationship with China in its totality, not just through the prism of trade. And we're not going to subordinate our commitment to freedom in Hong Kong or any place else. We're not going to ignore what China is doing through its imperialistic Belt and Road Initiative to put its tentacles around the world, I think, with a view to dominating it. We're not going to ignore its military buildup and the threat that poses to us as well as our vital interests and allies in the region. We're going to take this holistically, I think, is the right approach. And if we do that, I think we may well be able, as I say, to deter a bad outcome in Hong Kong, but we're certainly better positioned to deal with China going forward.
Okay, presentdangerchina.org is Frank's website on this topic. Frank, we got a few other things to get to today. I want to ask you about some of the chatter about Israel and the president calling out the Squad and their continued their desire for really the end of the one Jewish state on earth. They're pro BDS, which means they are they believe you should boycott, choke off funds to Israel. They see Israel as occupiers and oppressors. The president's called them out in a pretty big way. Do you think it's been effective so far? And do you think it's refocused people on what is really a crucial issue, which is how vulnerable our allies in Israel are in the region? What do you make of this news cycle?
I don't know whether it's been effective yet or not, Alex, but I do think it's vitally important. The president is drawing the lines in the strongest possible way. And I believe that it is still the case that the vast majority of Americans, Republican and Democratic voters even, recognize that Israel is a vital ally of the United States. Its enemies are our enemies. It is standing athwart those enemies' pursuit of, attacks against us or jihad, if you will, against the United States. So for all those reasons, in addition to, our solidarity with a fellow democracy and a state that has, so much history, and a lot of it very, very difficult indeed. There's a vital U.S. interest here as well. And I think that the president's clarity on this point will both help, frankly, politically, but also strategically in pushing back against the clear pressure that is now operating in Democratic Party leadership circles to, align with, accommodate, and otherwise protect these folks now emblematically described as the Squad, but they're only part of the cohort of now anti-Israel, pro-boycott, divestment, sanction, democratic elites that I fear would, if given their way, tremendously undermine the security of Israel and our alliance relationship with them. So I hope he'll continue to do this. I think it's necessary, and I hope that it will, in fact, to go to your question, prove productive.
Okay, a couple other things that I want to note with you. Frank Gaffney, again, is my guest, securefreedom.org, counterjihad.com. He's the executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy. So there's talk about the resurgence of ISIS, and Mike Pompeo noting that, Secretary of State, and also a bit of a standoff taking place between ISIS and al-Qaeda, which is kind of amazing. And ISIS claimed credit for a bombing that killed 63 people at a wedding. Should we be concerned here, Frank?
We have to be, Alex, for a host of reasons. Just very quickly on the ISIS piece, we have not defeated the Islamic State. I think we have very badly degraded, if not absolutely finished off, its so-called caliphate in Iraq and Syria. But the Islamic State lives. And it is now increasing its op tempo as a force to be reckoned with in Afghanistan, but also, by the way, in Nigeria and the West African area known as the Lake Chad region. They are building a caliphate in Africa at the moment. But with respect to Afghanistan, you do have kind of a mafia war going on between the Taliban and al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. But make no mistake about it, they're all mafiosa. And they all have in common what I think of as Sharia supremacism as their agenda. And whether it is al-Qaeda or whether it is the Islamic State or whether it is the Taliban, the last thing we should be contemplating is allowing them to operate with impunity in Afghanistan. And we heard yesterday the president's comments in connection with his meeting with the Romanian prime minister in response to some questions from the press, expressing his profound frustration about what's been going on in Afghanistan, that we're still there, we're still, seeing blood and treasure expended, and that we're now reduced to kind of a police force. We're not certainly doing much to win against the Taliban. Instead, we're engaged in a negotiation with the Taliban that I fear would, all other things being equal, result in our surrender of the place to them. And by the way, to these other jihadist operations as well. So I think that we need to be clear-eyed about this, and we need to be exploring, as he said, other options besides a negotiated, cut and run from Afghanistan, which I think is one of the options that's clearly being pursued at the moment.
All right, let's talk about that exact issue. What are our options in Afghanistan there? I don't think anyone wants us to be there forever, but what are the options on the table, Frank?
Well, I had an interesting conversation with Eric Prince this morning. And Eric, of course, as you know, is the former SEAL who has been working on unconventional warfare approaches for a long time, notably as the leader of a firm called Blackwater. One of the things that Eric has called for years is that we change the character of our presence in Afghanistan. We don't cut and run. But, for example, Alex, we've got a large conventional force footprint there now, something on the order of 13,000 military personnel. We also have a massive contractor footprint there. I'm told it's something on the order of 37,000 personnel in the contractor operations. That's a total expense to the United States, he tells me, on the order of the total defense budget of Great Britain. This is crazy, and I think the president's right to be frustrated with it, and he's desperately in need of alternatives. What Eric Prince is recommending, and I think it has merit, is to reduce that footprint on the military side to a relatively small number of special forces personnel to give us continuing unilateral capability there, but to partner up about 6,000 contractor personnel, veterans, volunteers, to have a long-term presence with the Afghan military to help them on the ground and in the air to fight the fight, actually take the fight to the Taliban in a way they're not capable of doing at the moment, and avoid the alternative, which is the one now in prospect, that we're literally going to surrender the place to the Taliban, fight them, defeat them if possible, certainly make it impossible for them to use Afghanistan again as a base of al-Qaeda, jihadi, Taliban, ISIS operations against this country and its vital interests.
All right, Frank, last one for today, and good analysis per usual. Again, there's some more focus coming back on Venezuela. It seemed like we got so close to seeing the ouster of Nicolas Maduro, but we have not. And now, apparently, according to a report that the Associated Press relayed, that the U.S. is in talks with a Venezuelan drug kingpin in order about ousting Maduro. What do we make of this, Frank?
I think it's leaving no stone unturned, I guess is the way I would describe it. This drug kingpin happens to be the sort of number two guy in the government of Venezuela at the moment. He's the head of the National Constituent Assembly. I believe his name is Diosdado Cabello. And he's an odious character, to be sure. He's subject to sanctions in this country. He has been compared by Marco Rubio to Pablo Escobar in terms of his drug trafficking operations. He, by the way, as I understand it, threatened to kill Mario, by the way. He is also in a position, apparently, to depose Nicolas Maduro through the so-called legal process of Venezuela, such as it is at the moment. And I don't know whether it's true that we've been having private conversations with him about doing just that or not. He denies it. It is a pretty unsavory prospect, I have to say, that we're dealing with him in any way. But there's some evidence, and you've been reporting on it at Breitbart, that we're talking with others in the regime as well. And as we've discussed before, here we are, the president met yesterday, as I said, with the Romanian president. It was on the 30th anniversary of the overthrow of Nicolas Ceausescu, a dictator for life in Romania. These things can turn very quickly, as happened with Ceausescu. He went from being president for life to a corpse in basically a day when his security apparatus turned on him. I think that can happen here, too. I hope that the U.S. government is going to not only help bring that about, but also to be positioned to really help the people of Venezuela get back on their feet once they've been liberated from Maduro and his evil regime.
Well, again, I like the no stone unturned when you're talking about an evil guy like Maduro. So we'll see how it goes. And Frank, thanks for the reports as always. Very knowledgeable and very helpful to the show.
My pleasure as always. Thank you, Alex.
Talk to you next week. We'll be right back.